Hi everyone. So this video is going to give you some tips and reminders about how to answer Psychology Paper 1 in preparation for your GCSE. So this is what your exam paper is going to look like. I'm going to zoom out a little bit actually so you can see it all. Now you'll notice I've highlighted a little bit of key information for you on this page. So our exam board is Pearson, also known as Edexcel. So make sure if you're doing any revision online that you're doing it for the Pearson, the Edexcel specification for GCSE Psychology. You will note that our paper 1 is 1 hour and 45 minutes long. And this is the paper where you answer all the questions and it's out of 98 marks. Now, this first paper is going to have the 5 short topics that we covered in year 10. So you'll have memory, social influence, development, the brain, and psychological problems. And then at the back of the paper, you'll have 1 9 marker on issue and debates and 1 9 marker on what we call the synoptic question, where it'll give you a scenario and it'll ask you to apply psychology that you've learnt to that scenario. One of my top tips with this paper is manage your time, because as you can tell, 5 sections and then 2 essays in 1 hour and 45 minutes is hard going. Our focus, don't forget, is not the essays. Our focus is the short mark questions and making sure that we get them right because they are what we call the money makers. But again, no question before you get to the essay is going to be worth more than 4 marks. So really, you shouldn't be spending any more than 5 minutes on each question. And you need to make sure that you're paying attention to that as you go through the paper. Just some tips as we go through them. So each section of the 5 sections will always start with a really straightforward multiple choice question. Always trust your gut. It does give you a bit of guidance here that you're just putting a cross in the box. And if you get that wrong, put a line through the middle. They're marked by a computer. So it's really, really important that you follow that information, because if it doesn't look like either of those 2 boxes, the computer won't read it and you'll get it marked wrong. You'll notice again that they always ease you in gently. So you'll see here after the multiple choice, you've got a 1 mark question and a 2 mark question. They always tend to just be AO1. So really straightforward description or defining questions. So state what is meant by the term morality. It's 1 mark. So 1 sentence just defining what morality means. And then here, it's 2 marks for describing why the medulla is an important part of the brain. And my top tip, don't forget, with that would be write a sentence explaining what the medulla does. And then you might use your second point to give an example of an area of control that the medulla takes responsibility for. Then you start getting on to the higher mark questions. But again, none will go over a 4 marker. You'll notice here that you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 lines of text before it even asks you a question. That means that this text is really important. Remember that whenever you see a word explain, I didn't mean to do that. Whenever you see the word explain, it means identify and justify. And that's why it's 2 marks. So your first mark is identifying what Andreas is likely to find in his study. And you can use the Piaget and Helder reference there as well. And then the second mark is justifying why that's what he's going to find. I would always say you need to take a highlighter into the exam so that when you're reading the question, you're picking out and highlighting some of the key information. So Andreas is investigating whether children aged 5 can understand the viewpoint of others. And if it was me, I'd be writing a little annotation there that says egocentrism. He conducted an experiment with 3 pairs of boys, looked at a doll's house from different positions. And again, I'd be thinking, oh, that's very similar to Piaget's 3 mountains. 2 boys looked at the doll's house from the back. 2 boys looked at the doll's house from the left. 2 boys looked at the doll's house from the right. And they've put boys quite a lot of time. So I'm already thinking ahead down here where it says 2 weaknesses of Andreas's investigation. Well, straight away, he only used boys. So I'd be talking about whether that's generalizable to everybody, including girls. Andreas stands at the front of the doll's house and he asks each of the children to describe what they think he can see from the front of the doll's house. Well, again, I would be questioning whether 5-year-olds can describe what somebody else says from the doll's house. Is that, has that task got task validity? But again, just by analysing that question, I've actually already got my answers for down here. Now, you'll notice again that although this is an AO3 question, because it's asking you about weaknesses, it's still following explain. So it still wants you to identify our weakness. So we've just said our weakness of Andreas's experiment is that he only used boys in his experiment. But then you have to justify why that's a weakness. So this is a weakness because it means that we can't generalise the results of the experiment to girls and therefore apply the findings to all children aged 5. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's an identify, justify. Again, though, just a tip here, don't forget, yes, it's an AO3 question, but it's still asking you to apply it to Andreas's investigation. So you have to put the AO2 in there. The mark scheme for this question will absolutely say, don't accept generic responses. So you need to be saying, Andreas only used 3 pairs of boys in his study. That's how you make sure you're referring back to that. Think of it as a history paper if you want to. You can quote that. You can quote 3 pairs of boys from the question. Again, these are all very similar. You'll note the command word is explain, and it goes with that 2 marks because, again, it's identify and justify. Again, here, explain, it's identify, justify. You'll move into the next section then, and you'll notice that all 5 of these sections on the first paper are all structured in the same way. So they all start with really straightforward AO1 questions, so just describe, and again, just little marks. And then it goes into the AO2 questions, where we've got identify and justify. And again, it's the same for every single one. So you should be highlighting the question, and then you should be identifying and then justifying. And I always like to think of this little sentence here as the examiner giving you a little tip. So you should refer to a form of amnesia in your answer. So that's telling you it's not going to give you a mark for this question unless you have specified whether it's retrograde or anterograde amnesia. So straight away, before you even write a sentence, you should be writing here whether it's retrograde or anterograde amnesia. I'm not going to go through all of these because you'll notice that they're really similar. And then you'll get to a question like this, which includes some of our research methods. And this is what we call the conclusion question. Now, it's 2 marks. The command word is still explain, so it's still identify and justify. But you'll notice here, it specifies you need to refer to the data in the table. So we need to go back up here and look at the data in this table, because we're not going to get a mark here unless we're doing something with these numbers. Now, when it's asking you to explain a conclusion, it's asking you to state what can Barry conclude from his experiment. What did he find? So again, just having a quick look here, he is testing the role of attention in memory. He's using colours for words. Participants were shown the words in the same order. It's basically saying, what did he find? So again, here, the number of correct colour statements out of 30. Well, straight away here, the control group got 30 out of 30. That's what we would expect, isn't it? That people can state a colour. But then here, you will see whatever condition C is, they didn't do as well as they did in condition B. And actually, I can tell that the difference there is 3. 3 out of 30 is 10%. So I would be saying participants in B scored 10% higher than condition C. That's our identify. And then justify, you're going to say, well, what does that mean for the real world? And again, that's where you need to go back to this scenario and you need to say, this means that Barry can conclude that when participants were, I haven't read the questions, it's really difficult to explain this one, but you might say when participants were presented blah, 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 they were able to do this. So it's like saying, what did he find? What does it mean? What can we learn from it? That's what your conclusion questions are asking you. Again, AO3, 2 strengths, but it's of Barry's study. So if you're not specifically talking about the things here that Barry did in his study, you're going to get no marks whatsoever. So while we're going through, we should be highlighting things like 30 words, a rate of 1 word every second. Well, that's a control, isn't it? So down here, when you're talking about a strength, Barry used really strong controls in his experiment, such as 1 word shown to every participant every second. That's our identify. And then justify, why is this good? This is good because it means that Barry's study is reliable. And if he were to repeat it, he would likely be able to get the same results. Okay? And then down here, you'll see that they've snuck in a little improvement question. Again, it's still identify and justify, and it's still about Barry's study specifically. Now, remember here, this is an improvement question. It's not a weakness question. So you're not going to criticise something that Barry's done. You're going to say something that Barry should have done better. Now, try and refrain from saying Barry did a lab experiment, he should do a natural experiment, because that's just not realistic. It's not a realistic change. But a good one for this one is always things like, should Barry put some controls in? Should Barry have used a control group? Should Barry have had a bigger range of participants to make the results more generalisable? But you've got to say what Barry should have done better and why doing that would have made the experiment better. So again, on these questions, you're thinking about things like validity, reliability, controls, extraneous variables. You're thinking about how Barry's research could be of a better quality. Now, I think we've covered all the types of questions really that you're going to get in the first section. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because they're all very similar replications of each other. You'll see a diagram. There's usually a diagram, you know, whether it's in the brain or whether it's in psychological problems, and it might be a synapse, for example. But there is usually a really straightforward label question. My advice on this one is just don't go too fast that you make a silly mistake of writing the wrong one in the wrong place. Okay, so skipping ahead because these are all very similar questions. Once you've done the first 5 sections, so obviously one on each topic for paper 1 here, you will see that we now get to our 2 9-mark questions that we've practiced extensively. The first one is always going to be on an issue and a debate, and it will tell you which of the 5 issue and debates the question is on. So here, I haven't even read the question, but the question is on reductionism. So this is on the reductionism versus holism argument that we looked at within memory. It's a 9-mark question, so we're going to spend 10 minutes on it, no more. And we know the requirements of this question are going to be really straightforward. So we know that this question is going to be marked as 3A01, 3A02, and 3A03. And I'm going to see if I can type on here, and I think I can. So it's 3A01, 3A02 and 3A03. And remember that my advice here is always the Wally weave. And what I mean by the Wally weave is our A01 obviously means that we're going to describe. So the question here is on reductionism. So on here, we would define reductionism. We would say, what is reductionism? That's our first bit of A01. Then we're going to do an AO2 point and we're going to apply it to the scenario. So in this scenario, in Adeline's experiment, reductionism is the fact that she's testing short-term memory using a list of words. AO3 is difficult really because it's either strengths and weaknesses or it can be research. And actually in this situation, the question is saying, is memory as a topic reductionist? So we can say, yes, memory is reductionist, and an example of this in research is Peterson and Peterson. And we're going to say Peterson and Peterson is reductionist because they tested memory just using trigrams. You are going to follow that structure for your paragraph, the Wally weave, 1 AO1, AO2, and AO3 sentence per paragraph. You only really need 2 paragraphs and then a little conclusion that answers that question of, is memory research reductionist, or is reductionist useful in cognitive psychology? So again, we're going to be saying things like reductionism can be really useful because it means that we can test quite abstract theories like short-term memory. But you're also going to say things like, but it isn't useful because it's not holistic, so it ignores other factors. What I will say on this is it's very, very difficult to achieve the top levels. They just don't tend to give them out. And that's why I always say to you, don't spend more than 10 minutes on this question because it's not worth it. Stick to the Wally weave, write 2 paragraphs, use your keywords, make sure you're explaining why, move on. And then finally, you'll see your final essay at the very back of the paper. But again, it's following a very simple structure. So it's 9 marks. There's no essay on paper 1 longer than 9 marks. And this is what I call the synoptic essay. This is where you have to choose 2 areas of psychology that you've studied. And again, it's really helpful because the areas are above you in the exam paper that you've just done. They're the 5 sections you've just answered questions on. And you have to apply it to this scenario. So again, we're taking our highlighters to the paper, we're reading the question. Cassie moved to a new town and started to socialise with new friends. She wanted to be part of the group that smoke, so Cassie started smoking. And again, in my head, straight away, we're talking about group, so we're talking about conformity, we're talking about social influence, and that's what I'd be writing on the paper. She says she doesn't want to stop smoking because she will be the only one of the group that doesn't smoke. So again, conformity. She doesn't want to stand out. Cassie's also worried that she won't be able to stop smoking because she's noticed that she becomes anxious and can't concentrate when she hasn't had a cigarette. Well, that's addiction, isn't it? So that's psychological problems, talking about the fact that she's got an addiction to the nicotine. So your clues are really obvious in the question. So assess 2 areas of psychology. Well, we're going to talk about conformity and social influence in why Cassie started smoking. She wants to fit in with the group. She wants to conform. She wants to share their norms. And then we're also going to talk about it's difficult for her to quit smoking because she has now got an addiction. That addiction might be biological. It might be inherited. It might be learned behavior, social learning theory. And you're just going to follow that Wally weave because again, it's marked in the exact same way that the other one was. It's 3 AO1, 3 AO2, 3 AO3. So again, it's just describing what conformity says about groups. It's talking about what addiction says about cigarettes and why Cassie's become addicted. Then it's the AO2, so talking specifically about Cassie, the group, smoking. And then the AO3, what research have you got that backs that up? So what research is there that backs up the idea of conformity, de-individuation? We're going to talk about Zimbardo. We're going to talk about accepting the social norms of other people in the group. And exactly the same again for addiction. What research have we got that nicotine is addictive? Why has she started smoking and got that addiction in the first place? You might talk about social learning theory. In creating the addiction, she's copied the behavior of other people. Vicarious reinforcement, if she's seen somebody smoke and then they've become popular because of it. So the AO3 is then the application of the research. Again, 10 minutes, no more than 10 minutes, making sure that you're using keywords and concepts. The most kind of common mistake on this question is people don't do AO3. So they forget to talk about research and apply studies. So make sure that you're following that Wally weave when you're answering the question. I really hope that helps. Please replay the video and pause it at any point. And don't forget that on your Microsoft Teams are loads and loads and loads of papers for you to practice and for you to have a go at, particularly in timed conditions, just to make sure that you're ready to tackle the exam. Good luck!